They have limited connectivity to the rest of the grid, but to your point about mutual assistance, some of that limited connectivity was able to bring in some electricity that was actually coming from Canadian provinces right down into Texas to try and help.
Welcome to Canusa Street, a podcast at the intersection of the issues and policies between Canada and the United States. Here are your hosts, Scotty Greenwood and Chris Sands.
Welcome back to Canusa Street, everybody. I'm Scotty Greenwood with the Canadian American Business Council, and I'm joined by my electrifying colleague, Professor Chris Sands of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Hey, Chris.
Hi, Scotty. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you.
Well, that's shocking.
I said electrifying. Chris says shocking. Shocking because we're going to have a wonderful conversation today about something a lot of us here in Canada and the United States take for granted, which is electricity. And a lot of us also don't realize how integrated our electricity grids are and what that means for our economy, our prosperity, and our collaboration together, our meaning the U.S. and Canada. So I'm excited about our fabulous guest. You're going to introduce him properly, but Francis Bradley not only has his own distinguished and wonderful professional career, but also his organization is a member of the Canadian American Business Council. So that's extra points and a gold star. We collaborated recently on a conversation at the Canadian Embassy on Canada-U.S. electrification. So maybe we'll get into that a little bit as well, because everybody wasn't able to go. But Chris, how about you introduce our guest properly?
It is a pleasure. And I think you've hit us with the top line. Francis Bradley is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Electricity Canada, founded in 1891. You weren't the president then, Francis, I don't think. Electricity.
He was an intern back in those days.
Well, it's good to start and work your way up. Electricity Canada, which is formerly known as the Canadian Electricity Association, is the national voice for sustainable electricity for its members and the customers they serve as the country, Canada, works toward net zero by a 2050 future. He's also a representative at the North American Electric Reliability Corporation's, that's NERC, Member Representatives Committee, and on their Board of Trustees. He represents Electricity Canada and advocates strongly for members in their activities related to Electricity Reliability Organization Enterprise and its role in ensuring the reliability and the security of the North American bulk power system. That's that integration you're talking about, Scotty. But one of the things that will keep me on my toes today is that back in 2019, Francis created and he continues to host the Flux Capacitor, straight out of Back to the Future, I think. It's a podcast series featuring discussions about the future of electricity with CEOs, regulators, political figures, and leaders from civil society. And the Flux Capacitor just aired, I think, episode 64. So it's a very long series, but I know that we're not just interviewing an expert in the subject matter, but we're also interviewing a podcast ninja. So I'll be on my toes. Welcome, Mr. Bradley.
Wow, you're a bit ahead of us. We're in the 50s, right, Chris? I can't remember.
We're in the 50s, yes. In my case, age-wise as well.
Well, we are excited for this conversation. You know, I mentioned at the beginning that here in Canada, the United States, we take it for granted when we wake up in the morning and turn on the light that there's actually a light going to be there. But there's a lot that goes into that, a lot of interconnectivity back and forth across the Canada-U.S. border that people might not think about. So maybe we could start there, Francis. What is the state of the Canada-U.S. relationship when it comes to electricity and power?
Yeah, really interesting. As you noted, it's something that people take for granted. It's one of the challenges, frankly, when kind of operating in the advocacy space with respect to electricity, because people do just generally take it for granted and don't usually think about it much unless the power goes out or something strange happens to people's bills. But yeah, that electricity relationship between Canada and the United States goes back 114 years. The first transmission line between Canada and the United States was operational in 1909. But it's been an evolving relationship, and it'd be I think, interesting to drill down on some of those pieces. Originally, it was all about the commercial relationship. It was just opportunities from neighboring jurisdictions to buy and sell electricity because the commercial opportunity existed. It is increasingly, now that we've got 35 interconnections between the two countries, it became more as well about the reliability and the greater reliability we get with the greater interconnectivity of the grid. So the ability from one region to lean on another region has been a significant boon to reliability overall. And then sort of the third aspect to this, and the one that I think is going to become increasingly important, is the environmental attributes and the environmental benefits as a result of that trade. And I think all three of those are going to significantly increase over time. But increasingly, people I think are going to focus on what is the environmental impact of that electricity trade, particularly as we move into a net zero future.
Well, absolutely. And the other thing is that a study in contrast, when I think about electricity in other parts of the world today, it's weaponized, right?
Yeah.
When you think about how much we take it for granted, you look at our friends, brothers and sisters in Ukraine who don't have the ability to turn on the lights or charge their phones or do the basic things that we do every single day.
Yep.
And so we are fortunate. We should understand that and understand the contrast. So as you mentioned, Francis, energy transition, net zero, it's not just about the fact that we turn on the lights every day and we get power, but where does it come from? Because back 100 and something years ago, when it first started, it would have been coal, right? Maybe wood, but talk to us about where does our electricity come from and what does the future look like?
Yeah, because where it comes from is changing, absolutely, as we look at that energy transition. And 100 odd years ago, it was a little different here, and it continues to be a little different generally in Canada. The first interconnections were primarily hydro ones in Canada, bringing power down into markets in the United States.
Hydro, you said. Let's pause on that. Meaning damming waterways and collecting renewable power.
Yeah, where more than 60% of electricity today in Canada comes from water spinning turbines in hydroelectric plants. But 82% of the electricity being produced in Canada today is from non-emitting sources, and so as it is a different mix than when one sees in the United States. But we have very similar objectives and aspirations. So the aspiration here in Canada is for the economy to be net zero by 2050, and then specifically for the electricity grid, the objective that the federal government here has is to have a net zero electricity grid by the end of 2035, which on the day that we're recording this, and you can see on the clock on my countdown clock on the wall, it's 4,731 days until we're supposed to have a net zero electricity system in Canada. But that is going to be taking place at the same time that both federally and at the state level, there are objectives with respect to the energy transition across the United States as well. So, how we coordinate our energy transition and how the United States and individual states coordinate their energy transition is going to be really important that is done in a manner that sort of ensures that we don't lose all of those things that we talked about earlier, the financial benefits, the reliability benefits, and the environmental benefits of that trade relationship between the two.
Francis, if I could ask you a question that's sort of I've been noodling on a little bit. I remember when we went into the pandemic, one of the things that 3M said about personal protective equipment that they were producing, you remember there's a bit of an issue there, was it wasn't really a supply problem that got them in trouble. It was a demand surge. And so understanding what had happened, it wasn't really they couldn't deliver. It was just that suddenly a lot more people wanted personal protective equipment because of the pandemic. And I think about that in electricity terms. Are we ready, or can we be ready, even as we're trying to get to net zero, for a demand surge that may come if more people have electric vehicles, if more people are looking to move away from fossil fuels? So it seems like it's a dual challenge, isn't it? It's not just greening the grid we have, but it's growing the grid we have and keeping it green at the same time. or maybe I don't understand this right. This is your field, so I'll tell me if I'm wrong, or maybe add some sophistication to that very simple version of it.
Well, actually, that you've nailed it. I mean, you've gone really to the heart of the issue here, Chris, and that is at the same time we're looking to decarbonize the electricity system, and we're looking specifically to electricity to be the vehicle to decarbonize the rest of the economy. So from a Canadian perspective, for example, the expectation is we're going to need an electricity system that's 2 to 3 times larger than it is today. And the reason why we talk about 2 to 3 times is we probably need twice as much clean electricity we need to be able to produce twice as much clean electricity. But to get twice as much clean electricity, we're going to have to build 3 times, not twice as much, because a lot of the new generation is going to be non-dispatchable generation. So wind and solar that don't run 24/7. And so, it does sort of change and impact the build out. Now, with respect to what the potential impact would be with the demand surge, it is thankfully not going to be like PPEs in March 2020, because we've kind of got a general sense of what that surge is going to look like. And so, for example, I know Brian Kingston was one of the guests on the podcast a couple of months ago.
Canadian Auto Manufacturers Association, yes.
Yeah, right. And so like we've got a pretty good sense what the electric vehicle rollout is going to look like in this country. So let me take that as an example, because I know you've talked about EVs in the past. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It is going to be a very gradual phase in. And so I get questions all the time from people about, what about the distribution network? How is that suddenly going to be able to provide electricity for everybody who has an electric vehicle? Well, everybody's not going to have an electric vehicle from one day to the next. This is going to be. I mean, we've got electric vehicle targets here in this country, but they will be rolling out over time. And anybody who has an internal combustion engine now, they'll be using it until the end of its useful life. And so, thankfully, the electrification of many parts of the economy is not going to be a rheostat where it switches on or switches off. It's going to be a gradual change, and so we built it out. But when I talk about there's going to be a need for a doubling of clean electricity between now and 2050. That sounds really big. But if you actually, start taking that apart, what does that mean? Well, that means we need to grow at about 3.1, 3.2% a year. Okay, well that's doable. Right. But it means that we need to be doing it. We need to be doing it now. And that's great if we're actually growing at 3 to 4% a year right now, but we're not. And so one of the big challenges is to ensure that we get on with the significant build out that needs to take place.
Absolutely. And my next question really goes back to something you'll remember, I think Scotty will as well, which is 2003. And in 2003, we had a station that went down, I think in Ohio, but for a few days, and we were all trying to figure out what had caused this system failure. And we had a lot of blackouts for the Midwest, for New England, I think even parts of Ontario. And it was a wake-up call for a lot of people how interconnected our grids were and how a problem could go from one country to the other. And I think we falsely accused Canada of being at fault, but you weren't on that, just for the record.
It was tree trimming in Ohio, I believe.
Yeah, I think so. And I remember that Quebec wasn't affected because they had a more insulated grid. They weren't sort of on the same problem. So I wonder if now, almost, I guess that's 20 years later, are we moving towards the kind of interconnectivity that gives us more grid resilience so that when something does happen, because things do happen, we can lean on each other and keep the power going in a time like that where you have a disruption?
Yeah, I think we are, Chris. I think a lot has changed since 2003. There were a lot of lessons learned from the experience of that outage in 2003. In the United States, we saw eventually the passage of the Energy Policy Act of 2005 that established NERC as the Electric Reliability Organization, and it moved us into a regime of mandatory reliability standards. When you look back back, before 2005, reliability standards were optional. So, I mean, that's a pretty significant change. Number one. Number two, we also see a lot of new technologies that have rolled out. So, in addition to now having mandatory standards when they weren't necessarily being followed by everybody in the past, we're also seeing some pretty significant changes in terms of resiliency at the bulk power level, but also down into distribution networks and for right down to individual customers. And so smart grid technologies, a lot of what's taking place on the ground is going to result in far greater stability and reliability for the individual customer. But the bottom line on all of this is there was a Canada-U.S. task force that was put in place in 2003 that came up with dozens of recommendations. And to my mind, I think all of them were implemented. So, 2003 was very problematic, but it was not only a wake-up call, but it was also an opportunity to figure out how we can get better and how we can have a more reliable system.
One of the things you point to in this interconnectivity of Canada and the United States, and I want to make an argument that it's a good thing, but you don't have to go all the way back to 2003. We want to remind our listeners, and Francis, I'd love you to react to this and give your thoughts of when it was unfolding a few years ago. But in February of 2021, something happened that reminds us of this. We're recording now. It's in the winter today. It's pretty cold in North America in a lot of places, in northern North America. But in February of 2021, the state of Texas endured a major power crisis. There were 3 severe storms in that month that triggered the worst infrastructure failure maybe in Texas history, and it led to shortages of water, food, heat, and more than 4.5 million homes and businesses were left without power, some for days, some for longer. More than 100 people were killed directly or indirectly, according to some estimates. So this was a big deal. And what strikes me is that Texas, in its wisdom, decided we don't want to be attached to the national power grid. They didn't want the federal oversight. They didn't want Washington, D.C. in their business. And there was a big crisis. So, Francis, we'd love your thoughts. What was going through your mind during that terrible time? And does it argue for Canada and the United States to help each other? When there's wind blowing in Minnesota, we can send it up to Canada. When there's water flowing in BC, you can send it down to us. So talk to us about interconnectivity and what you were thinking when Texas happened. Because it wasn't interconnected.
Yeah, I think it was shocking to anybody that was paying close attention to it. It was not the first time, unfortunately. I mean, there had been previous incidents. There had been reports that recommended changes from an operational standpoint that had not been implemented, frankly. And so, the first issue is maybe some of the pain and suffering could have been avoided had the recommendations from previous incidents been implemented. They have limited connectivity to the rest of the grid, but to your point about mutual assistance, some of that limited connectivity was able to bring in some electricity that was actually coming from Canadian provinces right down into Texas to try and help them. Help them and to assist them. It was of all places, Saskatchewan, which is not known as a big exporter. They did have excess capacity that week, and they were moving, everything they could, like 200 megawatts down into the market, and some of that was making its way into Texas. But we've got a history, and Scotty, you and I have talked about this extensively in the past, of this mutual assistance between the two systems that goes back a century. And so anytime there is a major storm, think Hurricane Sandy. The recovery from Hurricane Sandy was all kinds of Canadian crews that were down and providing assistance. The 1998 ice storm.
I was just going to talk about that. And I had just moved to Canada as a newly minted U.S. diplomat, and the ice storm happened. And the thing that a lot of farmers were worried about was milking their cows. Because, a lot of these cow parlors are power generated. You have these electric milking devices and things like that. So you got to get the cows milked. And then once you have the milk, you've got to keep it cold. It was winter, but you still have to keep it cold. So they were converting it to milk powder to store it longer during the power shortage. But that was a crazy time. And, that was a very nice welcome to Canada for me,
Well, what you would have seen on the streets, in and around Eastern Ontario and in Quebec were a lot of utility crews that had come up from the United States. So it isn't just Canadian crews that go down during Hurricane Sandy. It's American crews that come up here. So whenever there are reliability issues, we have these mutual assistance agreements, and the crews move back and forth across the border when these emergencies occur. Unfortunately, these emergencies are occurring. These weather-related emergencies are occurring more frequently. They're more severe. That's the bad news. The good news is, we've kind of got this history, and it's part of the culture that mutual assistance is how the system works. But in terms of how you coordinate between regions more broadly, there's a lot of great examples today, but then also let's project into the future. So today is, as an example, there is a transmission line between Manitoba and Minnesota that actually, yes, it does provide the ability for hydroelectric power from Canada to move into U.S. markets, but it also allows for essentially when the wind is blowing in the Midwest, more than the system can absorb when they're overproducing, the electricity flows north. And so those reservoirs in Manitoba, for example, act as batteries when we're overproducing in the Midwest for wind. That may be what our future in North America overall looks like, a future integrated grid where if you start thinking about what's 2040 and 2050 going to look like, how are we going to be able to meet those targets? Offshore wind? Yeah, absolutely. But how do you back up offshore wind? If you're on the Atlantic seaboard, looking out to 2050, maybe the offshore wind is going to be backed up through transmission into Quebec and Quebec's reservoirs. The same may be true on the West Coast. Is the interconnectivity actually going to give us the ability to unlock even more wind and solar really throughout North America? So it's a I think more interconnected and more robust grid out to 2050, not less so. So I think the electricity relationship is only going to increase because of the ability for the systems to be complementary. So, we hear a lot about, we'll follow the sun, larger grids across North America. We'll follow the sun, we'll follow the wind. But also from a north to south standpoint, we've got the ability for, reservoirs in the north to act as storage as well. So I think that's only going to increase, not decrease in the future.
And when you say the reservoir can act as a battery, what that means is you're not using the water to produce hydroelectric, so you're powering your grid with the wind coming up from Minnesota.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so even today, Scotty, if you look at the statistics in terms of exports and imports of electricity, you'll see that it is increasingly a two-way street. So that there are growing imports of electricity from the United States into Canada, and that tends to be when there's overproduction and the inability for the markets to take that power. And so like that gives us the ability to serve more customers without having to build more increasingly more infrastructure. It makes for a far more efficient grid overall. It lowers costs right across the board. And there's been some studies that have taken place that have tried to quantify that. The most recent one was a study that was done in 2020 by the New York ISO that found that even today, that free-flowing ties between Ontario and the New York ISO resulted in savings of about $43 million to the New York ISO market in their day-ahead market. So,
wow.
If that's the benefit we have today, what will be the benefit in the future when we're going to be building out, a lot more solar in the middle of the continent and offshore wind on both ends, and we're able to essentially connect those systems?
Yeah, so this is interesting. We're going to take a little break. And when we come back, we've talked a lot about what Mother Nature can do for us when solar and other power comes, but also during ice storms and whatever. When we come back after the break, Francis, I'd love to talk to you and hear what you're thinking about other threats to the grid that are created by people, not Mother Nature, like cyber threats and things like that. So we'll talk soon.
Are you red, white, and blue, or just red and white? Beaver or bald eagle? Ryan Reynolds or J-Lo? Canusa Street, a masterclass in cross-border relations. This is where Canada and the United States intersect on the policies and issues of our two great nations. But you know that already. That's why you're here. The question is, if you want more of this bilateral bonanza delivered directly to your inbox, and you know you do, how about signing up for Scotty Greenwood's weekly email updates on Canada-US relations? Head to cabc.co to sign up today. And now back to Canusa Street.
We are here talking today to Francis Bradley, who's the president and CEO of Electricity Canada, the former Canadian Electricity Association. And when we took the break, Scotty was about to ask a big question, so I'm over to you, Scotty.
Thanks, Chris. Francis, we were talking about things that are made by Mother Nature that impact our electricity system, but also threats from ice storms and opportunities from solar and wind, things like that, severe weather, what happens to the grid. But now equally, and I know you've thought a lot about this and you've advised governments on this, so I'd love for you to kind of enlighten us. What about threats to our infrastructure and our grid that come from cyber attacks? And how big of a deal is that? And what are we going to do to protect ourselves?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. And, as you said, people weren't thinking about this in 1998, but there was actually a small number of us that were starting to think about this in 1998 when we were thinking about, wait for it, Y2K.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's been a long time since anybody talked about Y2K, but we were starting our preparations for the Y2K. They were calling it the Millennium Bug, but we began that work back in 1998. But what it did is it began to get us to focus on first off the dependencies on cyber systems, even 25 years ago, and then increasingly a greater appreciation of what the impacts could be in the event of malicious actors doing something with respect to our cyber system. So that was something I began getting involved in 1998, and then early in the 2000s it also became a topic of some academic pursuits of mine at Carleton University in Ottawa. So I spent a good 20 years working on security files and cybersecurity files. And let me tell you, boy, that's something else that's changed quite significantly. On the one hand, the threat environment for cyber has been evolving, and it continues to evolve. It's a very significant concern for us. I keep pointing folks to 2015 as kind of that was the year we crossed the Rubicon. So up until 2015, I was always able to say, yep, cyber, it's something that we're focused on. But the good news is we've never seen a cyber attack that took out electricity service to customers. Well, that was until 2015 when Russia did that in the Ukraine. And so, right. All right, there's your use case where you can actually, through a cyber attack, impact the service to customers. But it was also a signal that increasingly state backed actors are getting involved in this space as well. They are very sophisticated and increasingly sophisticated, and so our approach to cyber defense needs to be equally sophisticated. And I think we've we've done that. I mean, we've created some really solid partnerships. Certainly, in Canada, I've been involved in quite a few of them. And on a North American basis, we have something called the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, the ESCC, that for 7-8 years now has been a coordinating group of CEOs. So this isn't IT folks. These are the CEOs of the largest companies in the United States, with 4 of us Canadians sitting around the table, coordinating our response to a variety of threats. And so sometimes it's physical threats, but also to cyber threats. And so the approach has become more collaborative. The approach has become more sophisticated as well, but it has to. And again, look into the future. I talked about some of the bright future of our ability to coordinate our generation and. At the same time, though, we're looking at a future where the cyber threats are going to get more difficult as well, because it isn't just sort of the consumer IT and consumer electronics space that's going to be using new tools like artificial intelligence and quantum computing. The people that want to do harm to our networks, not just electricity, but all networks, are going to have access to those tools as well. So we're never going to be at a point where we're able to say, oh, okay, we're done. We fixed cybersecurity, and so we can move on to other things, because the threat is only going to continue to increase. And so, we'll have to be ever vigilant on this one.
Absolutely. When I asked you about cyber, you mentioned Y2K, and it just dawned on me that some of our listeners might not all get that reference because they weren't alive during the year 2000. So just to unpack it for half a second, Y2K refers to the year 2000. And the worry at the time in the run-up, so this is the late 90s, that all of a sudden every computer was going to stop working because it doesn't know 3 zeros in a row. So there was all of this preparation for a doomsday scenario because it wasn't clear whether or not the computers of the world were going to be able to deal with the clock turning over to 000. So when we say Y2K, that's what we mean. Let me ask you one more, and then I'll turn it back to Chris. So we were thinking about the threats, and we didn't mention opportunities. That's something we want to talk about. There's a lot of excitement now in the power generation world about green hydrogen and blue hydrogen and brown hydrogen and all of that. And funny enough, this was coming up in the State of the Union address, like back when George W. Bush was president, and now we're talking about it now again. So talk to us about your thoughts on hydrogen.
Yeah, well, it used to be a little bit like fusion energy, right? Both hydrogen and fusion energy were just around the corner. The difference, though, is I think while fusion energy is still just beyond the horizon, hydrogen is almost here. We've seen a significant, first off, increase by a lot of players, countries, companies. We're seeing investments in the technology. We're not yet at the point where we're seeing significant rollout in transportation, but I suspect we're going to see some pretty significant rollout when we look ahead a number of years. With fuel cell vehicles, as the technology improves and increases. But I mean, the other side of this is electricity is in some cases it's difficult to move, and it's difficult to transmit, and it's nearly impossible to store in large scale. But if you convert it to hydrogen, if you convert energy to hydrogen, that can be stored, it can be piped, it can be you can convert it to ammonia and put it in tankers and ship it around the world, and that's basically electricity waiting to be uncracked, and so the hydrogen revolution, I believe, is upon us. Unlike fusion, that is probably still just beyond the horizon, and it's something that both your government and the government here in Ottawa have a great deal of interest in. And we know that there's governments elsewhere that have an interest in that as well. We had the Chancellor of Germany that was here in Canada a couple of months ago that was talking about the possibility of a clean hydrogen project in Newfoundland and Labrador that would look at developing clean hydrogen from wind and essentially producing it for the European marketplace. So we're very close to this being a full-blown revolution. And it'll be interesting to see where it goes.
Absolutely. And if you can create electricity or energy when the byproduct is air or water, that sounds pretty good as opposed to some other things that are byproducts. Over to you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you. This has been fascinating. And Francis, I know that with all the references to Y2K and George H.W. Bush, we may have scared off younger listeners, but we do have some. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about workforce. Whether it's the people who work on the lines and get our electricity back up. I mean, it seems we've been on a long stretch where we kind of downgraded people who work with their hands and, engineers. We've been trying to get STEM going again. Can you talk a little bit about whether we have the workforce we need for the future that you've described and what we can do to honor those professions, pay them properly, and really attract people into the sector?
Yeah, and those are really, really critical questions, Chris. First off, with respect to some of the trades, that's been a significant focus of our organization for quite some time. We launched a separate organization that spends all of their time focused on these issues called Electricity Human Resources Canada. They're very much focused on what is the workforce of the future going to look like? What can we do as a sector to ensure that we have people moving into those roles? Among the things that we've seen is a clear indication that the composition of that workforce is going to change. The kind of people that are going to be required is going to change. Number one, and then number two, we're going to need a lot more people. If we're talking about a sector that's going to have to, double or triple in size, there's going to be a requirement for many, many more people. How do we address that? Well, we've got a people challenge today, and we're seeing that right across the economy. It isn't just specific to electricity, but certainly, we're challenged, just like every other sector is challenged. That talent pool that you would draw upon is like a puddle right now. The pool has shrunk so much, at least on the short term. So we're very concerned about the ability to ensure that we're going to have enough people and the right people. And so we're very actively engaged in discussions with the government of Canada, actively engaged with discussions with colleges and universities and trade schools to ensure that we're going to be training sufficient people in that space. And it is certainly something that is very top of mind with the folks in the government of Canada. We're, as a country, significantly increasing the number of immigrants that are being welcomed.
I was just going to say that. Yeah, we did a whole series of podcasts on immigration, and I'm glad you mentioned it, Francis. A big part of the solution right across the sectors is to get more people into jobs, more people in the United States and Canada that can do the jobs, and immigration has got to be part of that.
Yeah.
Well, look, we are so grateful to you. We're coming towards the end of our time here, but I just want to kick it over to Francis to ask if there's one key message that you want to leave our listeners with. Our listeners, of course, care mostly about the Canada-U.S. relationship, but from your point of view, what do you think people need to know that maybe they don't?
Yeah, the message that I'm increasingly telling people, specifically in Canada, is that challenge of the 4,731 days left until the electricity sector needs to be non-emitting. That we have to get on with building that system. We need to build it, and we need to build it today. From a North American perspective, it's a very similar message, and that is let's continue to build that North American electricity relationship, because the mutually beneficial results of the relationship over the last 114 years are only going to grow, but only if we take the time to make sure that we nurture that relationship, we foster that relationship, figure out how we can continue to ensure that we grow it, because that future where both Canada and the U.S. are able to optimize each other's resources is something that will result in huge benefits to the customers in both countries, and that's in the end that's what we're here for. We're here for the end customer.
We couldn't have said it better ourselves. We think it's terrific to collaborate in Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and we'll see a lot more and talk about a lot more of the bilateral collaboration right across sectors when President Biden travels to Canada in several weeks from now. And so we'll be talking even more about that. And Francis, we love it when you come to DC. So next time you come back to Canusa Street. We'll all be in the studio together and we can talk further about it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Spectacular. My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me in.
And for our listeners who have really liked what they've been hearing, we remind everyone that Francis has his own podcast, The Flux Capacitor, available anywhere respectable podcasts can be found. So you can get more of Francis by checking out his podcast. And thanks for coming. You were a real pro. I was impressed.
Well, thank you, Chris. And it's a Canadian podcast. So the web address is thefluxcapacitor.ca.
.ca. There you go.
.ca.
Tricky.
That's excellent. Francis, I have the same problem in reverse. I'm always telling people how to find my email, which is at wilsoncenter.org. The problem is we spell center like Americans.
ER, not RE.
I see your URLs and I raise you one more because ours is cabc.co. So when I text it to people, I have to be really clear that it's not a typo. Anyway. Well, Chris, I'm not sure if everybody realizes how our grid is connected back and forth across the Canada-U.S. border. So it's kind of good to remind ourselves of that and how useful it is in the good times and in the tough times.
Oh, absolutely. And it's one of those things of modern life we don't realize, how tenuous some of the connections that we have are. And you just see people lose their electric power and they very quickly lose their minds. It's a real need, almost a basic requirement. And the fact that Canada is a reliable partner on electricity, that we're now starting to use each other's reservoirs for batteries, that we're addressing seasonality and creating an additional resilience, that's all good news if we have the people to keep that system maintained. And I really hope we can inspire more people to go into the field, not just to do solar and wind, but to deal with the grid itself. It's so important. It's what ties us together in many ways.
Absolutely. And it also reminds us that we have to resist protectionism. I can remember having conversations with some New England elected officials who will remain nameless about clean, green, renewable hydro coming from Quebec into New England. And, that was pretty controversial for many years. What they said to me is, I don't want lower cost, low carbon electricity coming from Canada that we don't produce ourselves. We don't want to import it from somewhere else. We don't want to transport it through our territory to serve some other jurisdiction. So it's important that we have these conversations because it can quickly become controversial going in either direction, north or south of the Canada-U.S. border. So I'm grateful for all the work that Electricity Canada, Francis and his colleagues are doing. It's important that we play, and we can play a small role at the Canadian American Business Council and on Canusa Street and talking about the Canada-U.S. border because, we're better together when we're helping each other. And if we were both on our own, we'd be worse off.
Yes, and now that we've finally done an episode about electricity, we can claim to be a current affairs show.
Haha, but we're here till Thursday, folks. Try the meal. Always good to have you on Canusa Street, my friend.
Great to see you too, Scotty.
But we're going to have to get better writers.
Probably true.
See you next time.
All right, see you too.
This podcast is brought to you by the Canadian American Business Council and the Wilson Center. If you like this episode, help others find our show and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.